I'm going to introduce Andrea Carmen, our first speaker. Andrea Carmen, Yaqui Nation, became a staff member of the International Indian Treaty Council in 1983 and its executive director in 1992. Andrea was IITC's team leader for work on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and in 1997 was one of 2 Indigenous representatives to formally address the UN General Assembly for the first time at the UN Earth Summit. In 2006, Andrea was selected as rapporteur for the UN Expert Seminar on Indigenous Peoples' Permanent Sovereignty over Natural Resources and Their Relationship to Land, the first Indigenous woman to serve as a rapporteur for an UN Expert Seminar. Andrea has been an invited expert presenter at many UN bodies, fora, and seminars addressing a wide range of issues. These include human rights, cultural indicators for biological diversity and food sovereignty, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Indigenous people's right to participate in decision-making, Indigenous children under state custody, including impacts of boarding in residential schools, climate change, Indigenous women's reproductive and intergenerational health, including impacts of environmental violence, enhanced participation for Indigenous peoples in the UN system. In 2006, we already did that part. In 2019, Andrea was selected by North American Indigenous peoples, tribes, and organizations to represent them on the new facilitative working group. In 2021, she also served as its chair. Andrea has 3 sons and 2 grandsons. She lives in Tucson, Arizona, and they have a family farm using traditional native seeds and pesticide-free growing methods. So let's give a warm welcome to Andrea Carmen.
Thank you. I ask for your permission to speak this morning in por licencia. I feel bad to share some of the things that I'm going to share with you on this topic. This isn't easy, so I thank the organizers, and I also thank each and every one of you who've come here today to hear these things, not just from me, but I'm sure all of the speakers throughout the day. And hopefully by the end, we'll have an idea of some solutions and some ways forward so that we don't have to continue to suffer this violence. Indigenous peoples, since the coming of the colonizers, I guess October 12th, 1492 was the day that we pinpoint. But since that time, we've continued to suffer from all forms of violence. I know my family was personally affected. My Nana, Maria Valenzuela, was a victim when she was 12 years old of a massacre by the Mexican army against the Yaquis, just a few feet south of where the border is. There's a church there still, and out in that courtyard it happened, and she was hid behind a rock with her little brother and watched her family be massacred, and she used to wake up in her 80s, with nightmares, and she wouldn't remember when we woke her up, and I finally got her to talk about it and found out what actually happened in detail from our chief, compadre Anselmo Valencia, who knew the historical details. But I'm just telling that story because that trauma passed on to my mother and to me too, and I've had to deal with those aftermaths. So it wasn't until my granddaughter presented to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples when she was 12, and she knew the story, but she had her own interpretation, and she said that she saw her great-grandmother, who she never met, as a hero, and she saved her little brother. She didn't run away. And she said, I hope I could be that brave. So she saw my Nana as a hero, not a victim. So I think, sorry, it's always so emotional for me to talk about that. But I think we need to go forward and follow in the footsteps of what happened before to resolve this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and relatives that is a global concern and human rights violation. So that's what I'm going to talk about, a little bit of what we're doing internationally for coalition building around this issue. First of all, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the standard that we use internationally. It took us 30 years to get the UN General Assembly to adopt something that we could consider to be the minimum standard. You can just imagine how long it took. It's the first and only international standard that talks about collective rights instead of individual human rights, because we are who we are and our rights are expressed through our membership in our nations and our peoples and our culture, our land rights, our language, and our identity is based on our peoples, our nations, and as well as who we are individually. So that's the standard that we use, and it says in it, it's the minimum standard for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world. I'm gonna put my glasses on to see what to push here. Okay. Yeah, the UN Declaration, Article 22, I think I need to go back one. Whoops, help. Okay, come help me, please. Oh, there, okay, I got it, sorry. Technical difficulties. Article 22 of the UN Declaration says states. So when the UN talks about states, they don't mean Arizona or California, even though they also are obligated as being under a subsidiary governments to the United States. But at the UN, states refers to countries. Member states are United States, Canada, Mexico, etc. It says states shall, means they will, not should, take measures in conjunction with Indigenous peoples to ensure that Indigenous women and children enjoy the full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. And we know that on this issue, they have fallen short. Even ones that have made a little bit of progress, it's far from sufficient to address this issue. Back in 2010, we began to have symposiums on what Indigenous women identified as environmental violence, and I'll say how this plays into the issue we're talking about today. The call began from Indigenous mothers and midwives and families from Rio Yaqui, Sonora, Mexico, when they realized that the contamination, the pesticides that were being sprayed over the whole communities, the pueblos, schools, neighborhoods, were beginning to manifest as severe birth defects, reproductive system cancer, deaths of many children that we've taken to the United Nations as evidence, and that many of these chemicals, these pesticides, actually were banned in the country that was exporting them, not allowed to be used, including in the United States. Monsanto was one of the big exporters. Other countries, Bayer from Germany, Bayer Crop Science, it's called, their pesticide division. And these pesticides are so toxic and cause so much death and birth defects and breast cancer and horrible suffering that they decided to call them environmental violence. But there are other forms of environmental violence that they also identified, besides the deliberate use of chemicals that kill especially women and children and infants. And that included the actions of extractive industries and the violence, especially the sexual violence and trafficking and deaths of Indigenous women and children and girls around what is called the man camps. But the Lima Declaration on for the World Conference on Indigenous Women back in 2013 recognized environmental violence as one of the forms of violence responsible for the deaths of many women and girls around the world. And that was a big breakthrough. That was an international conference. And the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, once we took this information to them, also for the first time recognized the term environmental violence as a new human rights term that we hadn't ever seen used before internationally. And they called for a study on the linkage between environmental violence, including the operations of extractive industries, chemical pollution, and the destruction of indigenous habitat, and the sexual and reproductive health of indigenous peoples, as well as issues pertaining to sexual exploitation, trafficking of indigenous girls, and sexual violence, with concrete recommendation on protection measures. We are beginning to see some of the protection measures be presented, including the agreement of the United Nations to change the International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management. That just happened in November 2022. So these things take a long time at the United Nations, but the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is just beginning to be addressed as a global issue. I'm going to give a couple of cases that we have presented internationally, and these are from women that survived the attacks. We also know with a great number of anecdotal stories, because the data just doesn't exist, about many women and girls that have gone missing and been killed in association with, again, the man camps and extractive industries. This is a case where 11 Mayan Yaqui women from Guatemala were gang raped in order to force the community to move to make room for the expansion of a mine back in 2007. And they showed that security guards were the ones that carried it out with the encouragement of the company, which is owned by a Canadian mining company, Goldcorp, one of the biggest gold mining companies in the world, based in Vancouver, Canada. And this case was accepted after a lot of struggle by the Canadian courts. The company said, no, this is on Guatemala, really, for what happened. And the Canadian court says, no, you're the owners of the corporation, you are responsible. The case is still going through the Canadian courts, but it did bring the attention on some of these issues. And they said that they survived, but other women in their community went missing and never were seen again. Another case, I'm just gonna bring you one more. I know this is, strong information, and I'm sorry for, any harm that it does cause, but these are the realities of what we're dealing with on an international, on a global scale. Again, in a Canadian mining company, Barrick Gold, again, one of the major international, multinational gold companies in the world, their security forces carried out gang raped 11 women and girls in Papua New Guinea, Indigenous women from those communities, and they refused to accept the compensation that was offered to 120 victims. And again, this is evidence that we have, anecdotal evidence, that the companies actually encourage this to silence the Indigenous communities that don't want the mining on their territories. And they said that they were offered in exchange, so that they wouldn't go to court or take the case to international bodies, chickens and used clothes as compensation to sign off, or that they wouldn't take their case. And I talked to some of the women at the United Nations in New York, and they said they condemned the women for accepting this. They said, but we don't even speak, most of us, the colonial language, let alone having any money to go to court or hire a lawyer. So, they accepted this as compensation for the rapes And again, they also documented many other women that are missing and not found. We've had testimonies from women in Argentina, indigenous women, where mining is expanding now for what's called transition mining, lithium and things like that, in addition to, you know, gold and coal and other kinds of mining that have always been taking place. And this is one of the, a representative, Sandra Ceballos, from the Indigenous Women Lawyers Association in Argentina, said that they find women and girls, young girls, little girls, just dead on the side of the road around the areas of the mining, which is why we're really focusing on this aspect of environmental violence. Here in the United States, we received testimonies about the impact of the so-called extractive industries on the northern border and the trafficking that happens there. The Iron Range in Minnesota, also the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota, and the Enbridge pipeline man camps. This is a demonstration they're having last year in Minnesota. That's a place that they have done a lot of research, and what's come out is really the tie-in between missing and murdered Indigenous women, cross-border trafficking from the man camps. One of our staff members, Rochelle Diver, who's from Fond du Lac Band of Chippewa Indians, her aunt was offered a job as a maid on one of these ore boats that cross Lake Superior, which is one of the, if not the largest freshwater body of water in the world, bordering Canada and the United States. And she was offered a job as a maid on the boat and didn't ever come back at all. You know, so women from the US side, Anishinaabe women, go on the ore boats, some of them as sex workers, some of them as, you know, maids or cooks, and they don't come back, but she says the boats come back with a whole bunch of new women from Canada. And so the tie-in is beginning to be documented, but like I said, unfortunately, even in the United States, there's not a lot of data. It's more just the stories that people are telling. This is a picture, a map from her showing the link, you know, in Thunder Bay, and, you know, the border between US and Canada is the lakes, is across the lakes, and those ore boats that go back and forth based on the ore, iron ore mines are one of the major basis for the sex trade and trafficking of women, and many missing and murdered Indigenous women. They said they just dump them into the lake when they're done with them, and they never turn up again. A real progress that we've been able to make, really pushing this issue at the United Nations and the International Indian Treaty Council, I probably should have said at the beginning, was the first Indigenous organization to have what's called consultative status with United Nations Economic and Social Council. And there are several now that do, but in 2011, because of the range of work that we do in different, whether it's climate change, you know, food sovereignty, human rights, women's rights at the United Nations, we were, I guess you could say, upgraded to what's called general consultative status. So that means we have access to a lot of different places in the UN. And by the way, I started this work as a student intern back in the 1970s. So there's lots of room if you're interested in, you know, fighting for the rights of your peoples in any of these bodies. But the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is what they call a treaty monitoring body. That's a treaty, international treaty, and the countries sign on to these United Nations treaties. For the first time in 2022, did what's called a general recommendation, and that's a roadmap for countries to implement the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And we were able to convince them to have a general recommendation on Indigenous women and girls specifically. and to include the idea of environmental violence. So you can look it up. It's General Recommendation 39, adopted on October 31, 2022. And in it, it says the committee recommends that state parties, again, state parties are the countries that have signed on to the convention, that they recognize, prevent, address, sanction, and eradicate all forms of gender-based violence against Indigenous women and girls, including environmental, spiritual, political, structural, institutional, and cultural violence, as well as violence attributable to extractive industries. And that was a huge step forward. This is a UN treaty body, way at the top. It's a legally binding convention. And they went on to say that states need to ensure that Indigenous women and girls have timely and effective access to both non-Indigenous and Indigenous justice systems, including protection orders and prevention mechanisms when needed, and the effective investigation of cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, free from all forms of discrimination and bias. And this addresses a major concern for us, because even in the United States, when women go missing, sometimes even the tribal police, I hate to say it, and I know I'm really proud of our tribe for the work that they've done, and I'm sure you'll hear about that from our Attorney General, to implement the VAWA Act. But many tribes don't have that, and those jurisdiction issues are still really muddy, and there's no action. We had one case of one of our staff member, family members on Pine Ridge, where they were waiting. They said, well, she fell in with a bad crowd, or she probably just went off with her boyfriend. And it was 3 days later when her aunties went out and found her body. And so, there's just a real gap there. And this is a UN treaty body addressing that gap. And they're listening to Indigenous women, saying that, in a lot of cases, there's no redress and no action until it is too late. And even when that they do find our sisters, there's very little action in many cases against the perpetrators. Just this year in February, the International Indian Treaty Council here at our Tucson office, it's on 5th and Ajo, if you want to come by. It's one of 3 offices that we have. Hosted an Indigenous Peoples Roundtable on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and relatives with mainly women. We did have a couple of men, but it was mainly Indigenous women dealing with these issues from Canada, United States, Mexico, Guatemala, and Brazil. And one of the recommendations, this is a picture of us. Some of you know the UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples sitting next to me on the bench. He participated as well, because we are encouraging him to actually do one of his studies next year on this issue in particular. The recommendation was to build and strengthen cross-border relationships among organizations working on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and relatives, and related issues to better address these issues and the impacts of international borders regarding human sexual work trafficking, exploitation, disappearances, killings, and other forms of violence comprehensively. And just addressing this border here, we heard, especially from Indigenous families in Guatemala, for example, that many of them are really struggling. They're already very marginalized economically. Many are pushed off their land and have to go to the city and have no way to sustain their families. So the coyotes come and say, oh, we got a great job for your teenage daughter, or, she might be in her early 20s, she can work as a maid or a nanny for kids in the United States and, send you money home. So they sometimes reluctantly, but they let them go, and those girls never make it to the United States, or if they do, they're already part of the sex trafficking and have no way to contact their families. So there's a lot of missing women that either have come across this border or they got sold to traffickers in Mexico and stay there. And that's an issue that has received very little attention until maybe recently. So, that's another example that we need to look at, as especially my nation being a nation that's on two sides of an international border, but many of our Indigenous peoples, like the Anishinaabes, like I just pointed out, from Minnesota, are also challenged like that. A big challenge, which I'm sure you'll be talking about today, is the lack of reliable, disaggregated, and accessible data. And one of your representative of the International and Treaty Council, who's now an attorney, she's a consulting attorney with us, but she worked for us in our office here when she was a legal intern through the University of Arizona Indigenous Law and Policy program. We've had 2 great interns from the U of A so far, and we're open to more. But we heard the statistic that Arizona has the 3rd highest number of missing and murdered, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the United States. And she tried to approach, this was about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, the Arizona state government to find out who are these women. And they said that Tucson has the highest level of murdered Indigenous women in Arizona. And we said, are these women from the tribal nations around here, Tohono and Yaqui and Pima, or are these university students, or are these women that are trafficked from Mexico that they find? And we thought, well, maybe those would be considered by the US government to be Mexican and not Indigenous if they don't have identification. But she was told that it would cost us thousands of dollars to obtain that data from the state offices in Phoenix. And she said, well, I'll come up and we'll make the copies. And they said, no, they were going to charge thousands of dollars. So accessible data, is a question. And just looking internationally, of course, I know you know this, and especially the organizers here know this, that the data says that the murder rate for American Indian and Alaska Natives is 10 times the general population numbers. Canada, they say 6 times higher. And Mexico, I just saw a study by 2020 Harvard International Review that 70% of the human trafficking victims are Indigenous women in Mexico. So these are issues, and other countries haven't even begun because they don't disaggregate the data. They don't identify the Indigenous women that are, separate from the general population. And I just looked up while I was, preparing for this presentation in Australia, the estimate that Indigenous peoples there make, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, they say they're estimating 8 times the average for non-Indigenous women there, but they can't find the data, and they say that the agencies, whether law enforcement or health or any other agencies that would deal with this, don't separate out Indigenous women. So it's really, again, anecdotal. Just recently at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues a couple weeks ago, we had a side event focused on missing and murdered Indigenous women, extractive industries, cross-border trafficking, to try to bring together Indigenous women from a lot of different countries that are experiencing these things, including the United States. And one of the participants was the UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who's based here. He's from Guatemala, he's Mayan Cachiquel, but he's based here at the university for his term of office as rapporteur, and we're requesting specifically that he do one of his 2 official studies next year on environmental violence, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and trafficking, to try to pull together data and recommendations beyond what we've already been able to get from CEDAW and other UN bodies for addressing this epidemic. We say, when we had the COVID epidemic, everyone had the statistics, and, but this is an epidemic where can barely get the data and information to begin to address it, let alone having commitments by countries to actually address this issue as an ongoing human rights violation. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I'm open for any questions. I have to go, you know, in a little bit. We have a pajo, a ceremony today on Pascua Yaqui Reservation, and I have some obligations. So, but I'm happy to answer any questions or take any comments on what I talked about. I think they have mics. You can come up and say something. I hope I haven't stunned you into submission here, into silence. I know this is not easy to hear, but you know, this is real and it's what's happening. And in order for us to find solutions, whether we're talking on the tribal, state, national, or international levels, we have to understand the problem and the extent of what our relatives are going through. There's one question. Okay. Question? Black shirt in the middle.
What are ways for us to get involved to like educate like more, so that way they're more aware of, like, you know what I mean, like letting their daughters go get jobs that are, you know, have jobs, you know what I mean, they're gonna end up getting kidnapped and stuff like that. What are ways to educate them, or like what are things we could do that way?
It was interesting. One thing we talked about at the roundtable, and our Attorney General, Alfred Urbina, was there as well. I think he's gonna, I don't know if he came in, but he will be a presenter here in a little bit. We actually talked about the role of casinos. And, you know, we're proud of our, you know, self-determined economic development, but, you know, they have targeted that casinos are one place on reservations where there's a lot of non-natives, and we expect them to be there, but there's nobody really patrolling. And here in the Tucson airport, on the inside of the women's bathroom anyway, there's a sign that, you know, are you a victim of trafficking? And it has a couple of, you know, because trafficking isn't always, you know, they stop on the side of the road while you're jogging and throw you in a van. There's a lot of ways, you know, people say, well, this is their boyfriend, you know, and they think they're in love, and suddenly he's, you know, parsing them out to his friends, and they can't get away then. They're separated from their communities. So one thing I was going to ask, you know, is if our casino could maybe just put a sign like that, like they have in the Tucson airport, on the inside of the bathrooms, both men and women bathrooms, you know, to kind of, and give a number people can call if they even have access to their cell phone, or go talk to security, you know, and
Even like some kind of button or something might help.
yeah, there's a lot of different ideas, I think, and once we realize the problem, we can start to talk about how to resolve it. I know my granddaughter worked here at the university, and there were cases of women, at least, you know, with sexual violence. I mean, once somebody's murdered or missing, you can't talk to them, right? At least not at first. But I think, you know, universities are known to sometimes, I'm not saying this one, but sometimes downplay those accusations. You know, maybe it's the quarterback on the football team or something like that, you know, to somehow, I think it's just going to be a collective commitment of Indigenous peoples, tribal nations, government institutions, academic institutions that have to come together to make a commitment to find solutions based on, you know, whatever they can do there. But, you know, I was thinking it'd be great to have at our casinos, even the same little sign that they have inside the bathrooms in Tucson Airport, just about, are you a victim of trafficking? And you know, they give a couple of guidelines, I guess, like, you know, do you feel like you can't get away from the person you're with? Do you have a way to contact your family? You know, those kinds of questions that may not come to mind, because sometimes trafficking that leads up to missing and murdered isn't what you think, you know. It may not be like a kidnap on the side of the road. So all these issues are things that women are beginning to talk about mainly, but also men and tribes and, you know, our officials, our decision makers, our policy makers on every level need to be involved with the solutions. Families as well, of course.
Thank you.
You brought up the issue of not having data a few times, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how to address that and how to get data.
Well, yes, they refer to disaggregated data as, I mean, separating Indigenous from non-Indigenous. And the US is beginning to do that, even though it's not perfect. I suppose Arizona is as well, because there is the task force now. But a lot of states and the federal government was actually told by one of the treaty body reviews called the Human Rights Committee. It's the treaty body for the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, reviewed the United States year before last. And this is one of the things they told them, is they must disaggregate data in the United States, have a way to do that. But a lot of law enforcement doesn't. So, you know, how do you collect that information? So, like I said, in a lot of places, you know, there's like Australia, you know, there's absolutely no, you know, data that separates if a woman is found murdered, for example, is she Indigenous or not, you know? So I think that's one of the things that we need to push for, and that's what I mean by lack of data. And that was one of the recommendations also that came out of our roundtable, is calling for data to be disaggregated. But even when sometimes they said, some of the, like one of the Dene Navajo participants said, you know, even if they do, you know, this is like on the reservation, it's really hard, or in border towns like Gallup, say, it's hard to get that information. Sometimes you think law enforcement might have it, like we had with the state of Arizona. You know, they made it impossible for us to get the data we were looking for because they were going to charge us thousands and thousands of dollars, you know, for that. And I'm sure the task force is dealing with those issues, but this is a universal problem and not just outside the United States. I would say maybe Canada has done the most on this because, you know, from years ago, the National Indigenous Women's Organization, NWAC, began to really call the government to task on the numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women there. And so there's been more action there, just like there's been more on the residential and boarding schools through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I can't tell you how, but I know it's always us, whether we're at the UN or, you know, in our own local communities, that have to push for this. You know, even these UN advances like CEDAW was a huge, huge advance. If this be even recognized by the UN, by a UN treaty body that's legally binding on the countries that have signed on to that convention. And I always think, maybe I'll just end with this, you know, it was here at the university, we had a review when Jim Anaya was the special rapporteur on rights of Indigenous peoples. He did an official country visit to the United States. That's where my granddaughter presented, you know, about her great grandma. And he went all over, you know, all over the US, seeing how the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples was being implemented, and came up with some really good recommendations. But I think it was Leonard Gorman from the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission Jim called here at the university a meeting of kind of the different organizations and nations that had helped put his tour together in the United States. And Leonard said, well, we got these great recommendations, but I'm just wondering why the UN doesn't have any teeth. You know, who's going to make the United States do these recommendations that this is a UN official, you know, presenting? And then he said, I started thinking, you know, and I said, wait a minute, we're the teeth. We're the ones that are going to make them do it. And I will tell you, having been there all 30 years almost, so maybe not the first 2 years, of the adoption of the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we didn't get anything that we didn't push for. You know, and I think that's true at your local school board and at the university and, you know, the state government, national government, and the United Nations, you know, too. We got to figure out what we want, and we got to tell them how to make it happen. We have strong rights recognition on this issue, but the question is, how are we going to take that forward and make that into solutions and make the countries responsible for what their own body, the United Nations, belongs to those countries, how we're going to take that forward and have that have an impact on the tribal local level. So thank you. Oh, one more.
I have 2 more questions.
Okay, okay.
I thank you for the presentation. Something that's really sticking out to me is sovereignty, right? Our tribes are always fighting for sovereignty, to maintain their sovereign status. And we just had the ICWA case that went before the Supreme Court. And so we're talking about tribes being a political status versus a racial entity. So when you're asking them to disaggregate data, we're asking to be racialized unless we ask for tribal citizenship. That's also when we're looking at data, and it's really hard a lot of times for law enforcement to know if someone was an American Indian or not, especially if they don't have any identification on them or they're found deceased. And so again, when people are not enrolled in a tribal nation, they then couldn't be counted as American Indian. And so this is what I'm struggling with this, the idea of international Indigenous identity, and even using the word Indigenous, because everyone is Indigenous to somewhere, and the terminology of an American Indian, which is a citizen of a federally recognized tribe. So I just wanted to bring that up because I'm seeing this kind of manifest. And if the Supreme Court decides that we are a racial category, we will lose our sovereign status as political entities. And so I just wondered what your thoughts are from an Indigenous perspective in doing all of this good work. Jim and I started his law career at the University of Iowa when I was an undergrad. So I remember seeing a lot of people like him that were new and upcoming and doing phenomenal work. And so I just wondered what your thoughts are about that moving forward for our people. Thank you.
First of all, Indigenous peoples, as peoples, have the right to self-determination under international law. And sovereignty is one way to say that. You know, there might be other ways to say that. Membership in an Indigenous peoples or nation is up to that peoples to decide. And when you say federally recognized tribe, you know, that's like, to me, that terminology from the Marshall decision, domestic dependent sovereign, you know, it's like, who decides who's recognized and who's not? We say the nation, you know, is, and as the International Indian Treaty Council, we also look at the phrase our Canadian affiliates say, you know, that treaties don't make nations, but only nations make treaties. And the UN Declaration refers to treaties and the relationship it represents, that nation-to-nation relationship. So I would just say that Indigenous peoples from other countries, even who have a very strong status in terms of their practice of sovereignty, don't really understand the federally recognized and non-federally recognized concept, which is Canada and the United States, really. You know, no other Indigenous nation has that. And the UN Declaration doesn't give authority to any country or state to decide who is an Indigenous people or not. And then that people decides their membership. So, you know, it's one of the rights having to do with self-determination. And there is a working definition. We've never agreed to have a legal definition at United Nations of Indigenous peoples, because the states would control it and someone could be left out or included who shouldn't be. You know, I was at the United Nations when the Boers, after South Africa, you know, went back to the run by the people from there, instead of the Boers, and said, well, now they're the indigenous peoples that are oppressed in South Africa. Everyone said no, because the working definition is a common history, identity, language, governing structure, and ties to a pre-colonial land base. So it's not just self-identification. You were there before other people came there. So it's not a racial, the UN Special Rapporteur, Pancho Kali, was the president of the UN Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And he always used to tell us, there are no races, there's the human race. There are peoples with a distinct political identity. So I don't think that answers your question, maybe, but I know the ICWA case and how that's going on, but it is a sovereignty and it's a government. We are governments, and we are working right now at the UN. One of the main initiatives is enhanced participation for what they call Indigenous Peoples Representative Institutions, which are governments, parliaments, traditional authorities, like we have in Mexico. And they would be recognized as governments with a standing, not just as organizations. Right now, you can be a non-governmental organization. That doesn't really work for our governments. I mean, they do it, to be able to go, but I think, sovereignty would be the key, and not so much racial identity, I guess. I look at the Samis, they're an indigenous people, they're from Lapland, they're, white-skinned, and I mean, so it's, the whole racial thing, in a way, is a construct of colonization, I guess you could say, Probably, like you say, membership, but it wouldn't necessarily be controlled by, federally recognized, enrolled, et cetera. It's recognized, I guess you could say, recognized by an indigenous people as part of that people, as a member, because indigenous peoples can define their own membership.
I can speak a little bit on the data issue. I work with Dr. Stephanie Carroll, who's kind of the premier person in data, Indigenous data. And so Indigenous is used for our group in all of the work that we do, so that it does include those that are federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes as well. So that's kind of where that comes in. And if we're going to be collecting data at the tribal level, if we're going to be asking people tribal affiliations, you have to have approval from that tribe to even collect that data. So just an FYI for anybody. I'm a researcher, so I am very, very cognizant of data sovereignty and governance. So if at any point any tribal affiliation is going to be asked at all, you have to get tribal permission to do that.
That's my understanding of how ICWA works too. Whether or not that child is enrolled or not, if they're an accepted member of that tribal nation by the tribal nation as a sovereign entity, then they're considered to be, within the parameters of a child that ICWA would. So I think, going back to sovereignty and getting away from federal recognition maybe is the key. Some kids are definitely part of a family from that nation, but maybe through intermarriage, or they just didn't get enrolled, they were born off res or something, So I think we really need to uplift the sovereignty, part of it. Yeah, enroll, but some children aren't. Yeah, but that doesn't mean they're not part of the nation, right? So it's up to the nation to say. Yes. Yes, I agree.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything, I mean, came up at the Permanent Forum 2 weeks ago. Some of the young people, we have a strong youth caucus there, were saying that self-identification was the criteria for Indigenous peoples. Nobody says that. We have a working definition that includes, ties to the pre-colonial land base, that collective identity. And the UN Declaration, I think it's Article 31, I don't remember exactly, but it's in there, 3031, says that Indigenous peoples, recognizing there is a people, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own membership and the obligations of their membership to the collective. So, there's nothing about self-identification, that I know of, at least in the international, discussions.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially with a lot of people doing the 23andMe. That's something that we're seeing coming up in the data sovereignty groups and discussions, is people that haven't culturally or ever identified as being Native, and now they're saying that they're Native. So yeah, it's something to keep in mind for sure. And maybe we can ask Mr. Urbino when he comes up here to talk about any kind of potential restructuring or restructuring and guidelines when it comes to updating the blood quantum rules or who is a member. So keep that question in mind. That'll be good for Mr. Urbina.
It's a good question, and I think everybody's dealing with it, especially in other countries where you don't have that, the federal stamp of, on your head of Indian, enrolled Indian, it's in fact, a lot of them would think that was, a sovereignty question in itself, so I think, and especially like for Yaquis, too. I mean, and how the enrollment process back, in the late 70s, and that so many of our peoples are from the Mexico side, our 8 traditional governments are there, and, how that interplays. I think, there's interesting questions around that, and yeah, I hope Fred can maybe, be asked some of these things too as well, but, self-determination means the right to under international law, the right to determine your political status. And that's an internationally recognized rights of peoples, including Indigenous peoples. Freely determine your political status and freely pursue your economic, social, and cultural development. Remember, development is not just economic, it's social and cultural. Okay?
Alrighty.
You probably
Thank you
heard
so
enough
much,
from me, right?
Andrea Carmen. Thank you. We're going to ask for Brianna and Joanna to come up.
Okay.